She walked into that store with nothing left but her pride and her mother's gold ring. A widow, a sick child. 9 days before losing everything she had ever worked for. Every person in that room looked away. Every single one, except one man. A stranger. A quiet man in a dark corner who nobody knew and nobody trusted. He did not offer her sympathy. He did not offer her charity. He said 7 words that cost him nothing and changed her entire life. But who was he really? And why had he been watching her farm for weeks before they ever spoke? Sometimes the bravest thing you will ever do is let one person see you clearly on your worst day and not look away. Here on this channel, we tell the stories that live in the dust and the cold and the wide open spaces of the American West. If this story moved something in you, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from.
The sky over Harlan Creek, Montana Territory was the color of a cast-iron skillet left out overnight. Winter, 1883. The wind came down from the Rockies the way it always did in January, without hurry, without mercy, with the patience of something that had never once been stopped by anything a man had built. Eleanor Calhoun pushed open the door to Dawson's General Store with one hand. The other hand held her son's. Noah was 4 years old, small for his age, and had learned somewhere in the last few months not to cough in public because his mother's jaw tightened when he did. Ellie carried one thing of value in her coat pocket. Her mother's gold wedding band, thin and plain, worn smooth on the inside from 40 years on a woman's finger. She was not here to sell it. She was here to use it as collateral. 25 pounds of flour, salt, coffee, and the cough syrup Noah had needed for 11 days. She did not ask. She offered fair exchange. Holt Dawson had known Ellie since she arrived in Harlan Creek 7 years ago as a new bride. He looked at the ring. He looked at Ellie. He slid it back across the counter without touching it. Dawson said, "I can't do business with the Calhoun account, Mrs. Calhoun. Not anymore." 31 years old, widowed 19 months, 9 days from losing the farm to the bank. A sick boy beside her. And the man who had sold her family flour and coffee and Christmas candy for 7 years had just looked her in the eye and looked away. She picked up the ring, turned toward the door. Agnes Fowler was standing near the bolt fabric. Agnes, whose roof Ellie's husband Daniel had helped patch 2 winters back. Agnes saw Ellie, looked down at her hands, did not speak, did not move, just turned her body slightly, the way people do when they want to pretend they did not see something. That was the moment Ellie understood. It was not poverty that had made this town close its doors to her. It was guilt. They knew something about Daniel Calhoun's death that she did not, and they had decided that not knowing was a kindness they were doing her. 2 men were talking outside on the boardwalk. She had known both of them since she arrived in town. One of them had repaired her wagon wheel once. As she passed, they stopped talking. They did not look at her face. They looked at the ground between their boots, the look of men who knew they owed something and had decided not to pay it. She was 3 steps from the door when the boots scraped the floorboard from the corner near the stove. The corner where nobody had been standing a moment ago. A voice, low, unhurried. The kind of voice that had learned not to waste itself. "Put it on my tab. She takes everything." 7 words. Ellie did not turn around immediately. She stood at the door with her hand on the frame and the cold pouring in from outside, and Noah's fingers wrapped around 2 of hers. The words sat in her chest like something dropped into still water. She turned. The man standing near the back wall was built the way work builds a man, not intention. Shoulders that filled his canvas coat like they had been measured for it. Hands with the roughness of someone who had spent years making things whole that did not want to. His face was weathered past easy age guessing. Could have been 32. Could have been 40. Dark eyes the color of creek water over slate. Not warm, not cold, just present. He was not handsome the way photographs were handsome. He was handsome the way a good knife was handsome. Useful. honest in its purpose. He placed $2 silver on Dawson's counter and did not look at her while he did it. Ellie said, "I don't take charity." The man said, "It's not charity. I need someone who knows this land, the geography west of the Ridgemont line. I'm told you know it." "Who told you that?" "People talk. People in this town talk about me being behind on my mortgage. That's about all they talk about." He said, "They talk about your husband knowing that land, and about you working it alone for going on 2 years. He said it plainly. No pity, no performance of delicacy, just a fact stated at its actual value. Ellie had been spoken to with pity for 19 months. Pity wrapped things in softness to make them easier to swallow. This man was offering a transaction. Transactions she knew how to handle. She said, "What kind of survey work?" "Boundary reading, water sources. I need 3 days out there, maybe 4. I can work your farm in exchange. I've got time mornings and evenings." "You're offering farm labor for a guided survey?" "Yes. Why not hire a surveyor?" He looked at her steadily. "Surveyors file reports. I'd rather not have this surveyed officially." She studied him. A man who did not want official records. In another moment, that would have ended the conversation. But she was standing in the cold with 9 days and no options, and a sick boy, and this man's $2 were already sitting on Holt Dawson's counter. "I'll think about it," she said. "Fair enough." He handed her the bag Dawson had packed. Then he walked out the door and did not look back, which was somehow the most compelling thing he had done. His name, she would learn from the boarding house keeper before sundown, was Colt Reeves. He had arrived in Harlan Creek 6 weeks ago. He drank coffee, not whiskey, did not gamble. These things made people uneasy in the specific way that sober, quiet men made uneasy the people who were neither. That night, after Noah was asleep and the fire had burned to coals, Ellie found something in the pocket of her old barn coat, a coat she had not worn in 2 weeks. A folded piece of paper. She opened it in the last of the firelight. It was a list, handwritten, of every repair that needed doing on the Calhoun farm. Written in order of structural danger, most urgent first. Barn roof joists, north fence line, the pump housing, the porch boards. Every item she had been lying awake calculating for months in exactly the order she had been calculating them. The paper was not new. The fold lines were worn. This list had been written before tonight, before Dawson's store, before the 7 words. Colt Reeves had not walked into that store by accident. The question that kept her awake was not whether to trust him. The question was what a man who already knew everything wrong with her farm wanted in exchange for helping fix it. He arrived the following morning at the precise moment the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Not early, not late. This was the first thing Ellie noticed about him. He arrived when he said he would. In her experience, this was rarer than it should be. They negotiated on the porch, in the cold, standing up. Colt laid out the terms without preamble. He would work the farm 6 days a week, structural repairs first, then fencing, then preparing the south field for spring planting. In exchange, Ellie would guide him on 3 survey trips west of the Ridgemont line across the coming month. No money would change hands, no debt created on either side. Work for work. Ellie set 3 conditions before he finished. She said, 1. You do not enter the house when I'm not present. 2. You do not discuss Noah's father with the boy. 3. If you leave before the agreed work is finished, I keep your horse as compensation. Colt listened to all 3 without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for longer than 3 seconds. Ellie counted, because she had learned that men who took longer than 3 seconds were calculating something. He looked past her shoulder, just once, toward the house, toward the window where Noah was watching from inside, holding his cloth bare, face pressed to the glass. Ellie stepped sideways, put herself between his line of sight and the window. She did it without thinking and realized immediately that she had done it. So did he. Neither of them addressed it. Colt said, Those terms work. No bargaining, no modification, no smile at her conditions like they were endearing. She said, "Start with the barn, the roof joist on the north side. If one of them goes in a heavy snow, the whole structure comes down." He said, "I know. I checked it last week." Ellie stared at him. He said, "When you were in town for supplies Thursday, I looked at it from the road." "From the road," she repeated. "The sag in the roof line is visible from the road." She could not tell if that was true or if he was covering something. It might be both. She said, "Don't check my property from the road again without asking." "Yes, ma'am." He said it without sarcasm. Went directly to the barn. She watched him go, then looked at the window where Noah had pressed his nose flat against the glass, watching the stranger walk across their yard. The real condition, the one she had not said aloud, was the boy. Everything else was negotiable. Noah was not. Noah Calhoun was 4 years old with brown hair like his mother and gray eyes that were his own. He spoke carefully and seldom, in the way of children who had spent a lot of time in quiet houses. The first morning Colt was working, Noah slipped out the back door without telling Ellie, and walked across the frozen yard to stand 6 feet from where Colt was inspecting the barn wall. He did not speak. Colt noticed him but continued working for a full minute before saying anything. Colt said, "You're not supposed to be out here." Noah said, "I know. Your boots aren't buckled." Noah looked down. His boots were indeed unbuckled. "I forgot. Sit on that crate and buckle them before you go back in. Ground's icy." Noah sat on the crate, buckled his boots with the focused attention of a child who had something else on his mind. Then he said, "Do you know how to fix things?" Colt said, "Some things." "Can you fix everything?" Colt looked at the boy. "No, nobody can fix everything." Noah considered this. "Mama tries to." Colt said, "I know." And the way he said it told Ellie, who had come to the barn door in time to hear this exchange, that he had been watching her try for longer than 6 weeks. She said nothing. She turned and went back to the house. But she stood at the kitchen window for a moment, watching Colt return to the barn wall. Daniel had never once noticed when Noah's boots were unbuckled. 3 nights later, unable to sleep, Ellie went to check on Noah and found him asleep with something tucked beside his cloth bear. A small wooden horse, rough-carved, the kind a man made with a pocket knife when he had time and nothing else to do with his hands. Noah's name was scratched into the base. Ellie held it in the lamplight for a long time. Colt had made this for her son, had not mentioned it, had not presented it as a gift or a gesture or a thing to be thanked for, had just left it where the boy would find it. Ellie set it back in Noah's hand, went to the window, looked out at the dark yard where the fence line was straight and the barn roof was solid. She had been waiting for Colt Reeves to reveal what he wanted. She was starting to fear the answer was nothing she knew how to receive. By the end of the second week, they had found a working rhythm. It had not been planned. It arrived the way weather arrived, gradually and then all at once, until one morning Ellie looked up from the water pump housing and realized she had stopped bracing for whatever Colt was about to do wrong. Day 4 brought the roof. Temperature 9 below, north wind. Ellie climbed to the barn roof before Colt could say anything. She had done it alone 12 times. He did not say, "Let me do that." He took the opposite end and they worked from the outside edges toward the center. He took his time with each nail, measured twice, set it clean. On the south end, where the wood was weakest, he doubled the support without being told. He had assessed the structure and was compensating for its specific failures. When they met at the center ridge, their hands were 6 inches apart on the same beam. Neither looked at the other. Ellie said, "You've done roof work before." It was not a question. Colt said, "Some." "Where?" "Different places." She let it go. She was more interested in the fact that he was protecting the west-facing section more heavily than the east, which was the correct call because the worst weather in this valley came from the west-northwest, and knowing that required knowing this specific valley, not just roofing in general. He had studied this land, not from a road. Day 8 brought a heavy snowfall that made outdoor work impossible. The pump housing inside the root cellar had frozen at the joint and needed to be accessed from below the kitchen floor. First time Colt entered the house per their agreement. They worked together on the kitchen floor with the boards pulled up, both leaning into the narrow cellar access. It was close quarters, close enough that she could hear him breathe. He fixed the joint his way. It held for 30 minutes, and then failed again. Ellie watched it fail, then went to the corner where she kept her mother's tool roll, a canvas wrap of instruments her mother had brought from Missouri, some of them specific to techniques no hardware catalog carried. She took out a particular clamp and reset the joint in a way that accounted for the expansion pattern of this valley's clay soil in deep freeze. It held. Colt looked at the repair, looked at the tool, said nothing for a moment. He said, "That's not standard. It's not." Ellie said, "No. It works better." "Yes. Where'd you learn that?" "My mother." He nodded, filed it, did not push. And Ellie noticed that he was not embarrassed to have his method corrected. He just looked at the better solution and accepted it as the better solution. She had not encountered that in a man before. Not once. Day 13, Colt stayed past dark by accident. A fence section had taken longer than expected. Ellie, without planning to, set a third plate on the table. He saw it when he came in to wash up and stopped in the doorway. She did not explain it. Neither did he. Dinner was Noah talking, about a hawk he had seen, about a picture he had drawn, about whether bears dreamed in winter. Colt answered in his careful way, never talking down, never performing enthusiasm, just responding as though the boys' questions were worth the honest consideration they deserved. Noah said, "Mr. Reeves, do you have a family?" Ellie started to redirect him. Colt said, "It's all right." He looked at the boy. "Not anymore." "Did they die?" "Yes. My papa died. Mama says he watches over us." Noah tilted his head. "Do you think your family watches over you?" Something moved in Colt's face. Not quite pain, or not only pain. Something that had lived under pain for a long time and had a different texture. He said, "I hope so. Some days more than others." After Noah was in bed, Ellie found Colt had done the dishes without being asked. He was drying the last pan when she came into the kitchen. They were standing close, the way kitchens made people stand close. She reached past him for the dish rack and her arm crossed near his. Neither moved back. Colt said, "Thank you for dinner." Ellie said, "Thank you for the fence." It was nothing. It was the most ordinary exchange in the world. And yet when he left and she stood at the closed door listening to his horse move away through the dark, she realized her hands had stopped trembling for the first time since before Daniel died. She did not know what to do with that information. So she went to bed. The survey trips happened twice that second week, west of the Ridgemont line into the foothills where the creek bent north before dropping toward the valley floor. Ellie knew these trails the way she knew her own kitchen, by feel and habit, and the particular way light fell through certain draws at certain hours. Colt moved through the land with attention. He was not looking at scenery. He was reading something, the way her mother had taught her to read weather, the way you read a face when you needed to know what was true rather than what was being said. On the second trip, at the point where the creek came up from underground through an artesian shelf in the rock, Colt stopped his horse and sat for a long time without speaking. Ellie said, "That's where it comes from. Runs year-round, never freezes. My father-in-law chose this land for that shelf." Colt said, "How many people know about it?" "Farmers down valley have always known. It feeds 3 other properties when it runs off the northeast corner." "And Vance." It was not a question. Ellie said, "And Vance." Colt sat looking at the water coming up through stone, clean and cold and indifferent to anything men had built above it. Then he said, "We should get back before it clouds up." He was right about the weather again. By the time they reached the farm, the sky had gone the color of pewter and the temperature had dropped 6 degrees. That evening, alone on the porch after Colt had left, Ellie did something she had not done since the summer before Daniel died. She stood in the dark and read the sky the way her mother had shown her. The cloud patterns, the wind direction, the particular way the stars looked before a weather change. She did not look around to check if anyone could see her. She just did it. And for the moment she was doing it, she was fully herself, in a way she had not been for a long time. When she turned to go inside, she found Colt had come back. His horse was at the post, and he was standing at the edge of the porch, having not announced himself. He had been watching her read the sky. He did not look apologetic. He looked like a man who had just understood something important. He said, "The water on your northeast corner, the source that feeds the creek, this isn't about the mortgage." Ellie said, "No, I didn't think it was." She went inside. He stood on the porch a moment, looking at the northeast corner of the property in the dark. Before he mounted, he took a folded paper from his breast pocket, looked at it, then put it back. His expression for the space between one breath and the next was not steady. It was the face of a man who was running out of time on something. Silas Vance arrived on a Tuesday afternoon unannounced, carrying a basket from Dawson's store. Flour, dried apple, a jar of honey. He tied his horse at the gate and walked to the door with the confidence of a man who had never been turned away from a door in his life. He was 56 years old, president of First Territorial Savings Bank of Harlan Creek, silver hair kept well, Eastern-cut suits that arrived twice yearly from a St. Louis tailor and made him look like a man who had not yet decided whether he belonged here or was merely visiting. He never raised his voice. He did not need to. He said, "Mrs. Calhoun, I heard Noah had a rough winter. I wanted to be sure you're both getting on." Ellie took the basket because refusing it in front of the boy would require an explanation she did not want to give Noah. She did not invite Vance inside. She said, "We're fine, Mr. Vance. Thank you for the trouble." Vance's eyes moved over her shoulder, past her, to the barn. Newly repaired, the roofline straight. New lumber pale against the weathered gray. Then to the fence line, mended and solid. Then to the water pump housing, which someone had reinforced against the cold. He said, "You've had work done." His voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. "I didn't realize you'd taken on a hired man." "Exchange of labor." "With?" "A man named Colt Reeves. He's staying at the Ridgemont." Vance absorbed this, smiled with his mouth. "Daniel always said you were resourceful, Ellie." He used Daniel's name. He used her first name. Both in the same sentence, the way a man did when he wanted to remind you that he had known your life before you did. Ellie said, "I'll let you know if we need anything, Mr. Vance." He nodded pleasantly, turned to go, paused as though a thought had just occurred to him. He said, "The bank's position on the farm hasn't changed, of course. But if you find yourself needing an arrangement that gives you more time, my door is open, out of respect for Daniel's memory." He left before she could respond. She watched him ride down the lane, holding the door frame with both hands. He turned his horse toward the barn on his way out. Colt was resetting a post near the water trough. He did not stop working when Vance approached. Vance said, "You're the man helping Mrs. Calhoun." Colt said, "Yes." "Charitable work? Exchange of labor?" "Right." Vance watched him work. Let the silence sit for 8 seconds, the silence he used on men who could be made uncomfortable by silence. Colt set another post. Vance said, "This farm's going to the bank in a week. You're putting considerable effort into a property that won't belong to its current owner much longer." Colt drove the post with one clean stroke. He looked up at Vance for the first time. "Then I better work fast." Vance studied him, the way Vance looked at things he was trying to price. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite recognition, the suggestion of it. He said, "Have we met before?" Colt said, "I get around," and went back to work. Vance rode out without another word. But he turned in his saddle once before the lane curved and looked back at Colt with the particular attention of a man updating a calculation. What the town did not know, what Ellie did not know, was this. Vance had not simply taken Daniel Calhoun's farm through a predatory loan. He had arranged for Daniel to be poisoned, a compound added to the whiskey served in the Silverhorn's back room on the night Daniel had been trying to negotiate his way out of the debt. The doctor who signed the death certificate owed Vance a gambling debt of his own. The sheriff owed Vance the same. In Harlan Creek in 1883, Silas Vance did not own people. He owned what people owed, which was functionally the same thing. Late that same night, after the lamp oil in the bank office had burned down to almost nothing, Vance sat at his desk. He opened the bottom drawer and took out a small tintype photograph. A woman and two children, posed in the stiff, formal manner of early portrait photography. He looked at it for a long moment. His face for just this moment was the face of a man who knew exactly what he had traded away and had decided the trade was necessary. Then he put the photograph back, closed the drawer, returned to his ledger. He was not a monster who did not know he was a monster. He was something more unsettling. A man who had made a series of choices that required each subsequent choice to protect the one before it, and had followed that chain so far that turning back was no longer a concept that fit in his mind. The next morning, 16 days into their arrangement, Colt found 3 sets of boot prints in the snow behind the barn before Ellie was awake. Someone had stood there in the night, watching the house from the east side, where they could see both the back door and the water pump housing. 3 distinct treads. They had stood for a while, then left toward the ridge road. He did not tell Ellie when she came out. He wanted to see how she moved through her morning, whether she already knew. She did. He watched her take the long way to the chicken coop, the route that passed the boot prints. She glanced at them without stopping, then continued to the coop, gathered the eggs, came back to the house. Her pace was the same. Her face was the same. But when she reached the back door, she paused before going in, and her eyes moved to the ridge road, reading the tree line. She had already clocked it, the previous night. That afternoon, a neighboring rancher's bull broke through the shared fence line. The animal was large, irritated, and had come into the yard at a canter. Noah was in the yard. Ellie was in the barn loft. Colt was on the far side of the property, 30 yards away with uncertain ground between them. He ran. Ellie appeared at the barn loft door, dropped to the lower railing in a movement with no wasted step in it, landed on the ground, and in one continuous motion picked up the rifle leaning beside the barn door, raised it, and fired once. Not at the bull. At the frozen ground 8 feet in front of it. The bull stopped. The sound had redirected its attention. Noah scrambled to the fence post, and Ellie was already moving between him and the animal, rifle at her hip, her body between the threat and her son. She did not fire again. She read the bull's posture and waited it out. By the time Colt reached her, it was over. Noah was clinging to his mother's coat, and she was checking him with both hands, systematic, every limb. Colt said, "He's all right." Ellie said, "I know." She stood, put the rifle back against the barn wall in exactly the same position, and looked at the fence gap. "That's going to need to be done today instead of next week." Colt said, "Yes." He looked at the place she had been standing when she fired. The angle, the distance, the speed of it. He said, "Who taught you to shoot like that?" Ellie picked up Noah. "My father." That wasn't a blacksmith shooting stance. She looked at him. Then with Noah on her hip, she went inside the house. That evening, when Noah was asleep, Ellie said, "My mother was part Crow, her grandmother's side. We didn't talk about it. My father's family thought it was better not to." Colt said, but she taught you. In ways that didn't look like teaching. She'd just do things a certain way and I'd watch. A pause. Daniel thought it was better if I didn't. He said it made people uneasy. A woman who knew too much about land and animals. Colt said, Daniel was wrong. Ellie looked up. He was saying it flatly as a point of fact, not as comfort or as challenge. Just, that was wrong. She did not know what to do with a statement that simple. So she looked back down at the mending. She said, You found the boot prints. This morning. I found them last night. I was going to tell you today. Why didn't you come get me last night? Because I didn't know you yet. She tied off a thread. I know you a little better now. That was the closest thing to a declaration of trust that Ellie Calhoun had made since before her husband died. Neither of them treated it like a small thing. Day 22. The worst storm of the season arrived without the full warning the sky usually gave. A wet front from the southwest turned to a hard freeze overnight, dropping visibility to nothing by 7 in the evening. Colt was still at the farm when it hit. He could not ride in a whiteout on an icy road. Ellie could not ask him to. He would sleep in the barn. But first, there were several hours to account for. Noah went to sleep at his regular hour, worn out from a day of helping with fence work, or helping in the way that 4-year-olds helped, which meant narrating everything and occasionally holding things. Ellie and Colt sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table. Fire in the stove. The storm throwing itself against the house in waves. She was mending. He was sharpening a knife. The slow, rhythmic draw of blade on whetstone that needed no eyes to do correctly. 1 hour of near silence. The particular silence of two people who had stopped being uncomfortable with each other's presence without planning to. Then Ellie said, not looking up, Your leg, the cold makes it worse. It makes... He stopped the knife. Yes. Old break or muscle damage? Both. Do you want to say how? He was quiet for longer than usual. It will change how you see me, she said. Most things do. Another silence. He set the knife down and looked at his hands, not the way a man looked at his hands to inspect them, but the way a man looked at his hands when he was trying to decide if they were the hands of the person he wanted to be. He said, I had a younger brother, Hud, came west ahead of me, found land in the Gallatin Valley, thought he'd found something real, took a loan from a bank to start it. Ellie set her mending down. Colt said, The banker offered Hud a contract that looked fair and wasn't. By the time Hud understood what was in it, he owed more than the land was worth, and the interest was compounding faster than any harvest could cover. Banker was patient. That kind of patient that means you've done it before and you know exactly how long it takes. Ellie said quietly, Vance? Vance. Colt's voice did not change pitch. It became flatter, which was not the same thing. Hud tried to fight it legal for 2 years. Couldn't afford a lawyer good enough. Couldn't prove what he could feel was wrong. Lost the land in the 3rd year. Vance put Hud to work on a crew doing maintenance on the properties he'd foreclosed. Said it was a debt repayment arrangement. Hud worked 18 months on his own land without being able to call it his. Ellie said, Where is Hud now? Colt stopped. Last winter. He stopped again. He ran out of reasons to keep going. They found him in February. The fire popped. Outside, the storm shouted against the roof. Ellie did not say, I'm sorry. She had I'm sorry said to her until the phrase had lost its shape. She did not say anything. She stood up, went to the stove, and filled 2 cups with the coffee she had been keeping warm. She set one in front of him and sat back down. That was all. That was everything, Colt said after a while. My leg. Hud's foreman didn't appreciate that I came asking questions about the arrangement. There were 3 of them. Ellie said, Did you get answers? Eventually. They sat with the fire and the storm for another hour. Then Noah started coughing in the other room, the particular cough that meant his chest was tightening, Both of them were on their feet at the same time. The fact of both of them moving, the instinct in both of them to go to the child, stopped them both in the doorway. They looked at each other. Then Ellie went into Noah, and Colt went to heat water and find the dried herb she kept on the third shelf, which he knew because he had been paying attention. They brought Noah to the kitchen near the stove and sat with him on either side while the steam did its work. Noah fell back to sleep between them, one small hand open on the blanket. Colt's finger and Ellie's finger were both reaching to pull the blanket higher at the same moment. They touched. Both stopped. Neither moved away. 2 inches between them. The storm outside. The child between them. The fire. Some things did not need to be spoken to be understood. Noah slept. The storm pressed hard against the house. Colt said quietly, not wanting to break the particular quality of the silence, "I came to Harlan Creek to find what Vance did to HUD, to find the records, to find something that could be used." Ellie said, "I know." He looked at her. She said, "The list in my pocket, the way you know this land. You've been watching this farm since before we spoke." She looked at the sleeping boy. "I didn't think it was about surveying. I didn't think you did." He looked at his hands again. "I should have told you." "Yes, you should have. Are you asking me to leave?" Ellie was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I'm asking you to not keep things from me going forward. There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. Outside, the storm ran hard until past midnight. Inside the kitchen, by the light of the low lamp, 2 people who had each spent years learning to carry things alone sat with their hands 2 inches apart and breathed the same warm air and did not talk about what it meant. They did not need to, not yet. In the morning, Colt went to the barn, saddled his horse, and came back to start on the south fence. Ellie put coffee on and did not explain why she made enough for 2. He did not explain why he came back to the kitchen to drink it before starting work. Noah ate his breakfast and watched both of them and said nothing. He was 4 years old and he had already understood something the adults were slower to arrive at, day 26, 4 days before the foreclosure deadline. Everything had been moving in the right direction. Colt had contacted a lawyer in Billings through a letter sent under a different name, routed through the Ridgemont Ranch mail, about the forged signature on the mortgage. The lawyer's preliminary response was cautiously encouraging. The fence was up. The south field was prepared. Ellie had sold the first dozen eggs from the chickens that had started laying again and put the money in the tin on the kitchen shelf. For the first time in 19 months, the farm was producing. Then the world reassembled itself. Vance arrived at the farm at mid-morning with a copy of the Harlan Creek Courier folded to the back page. He handed it to Ellie without drama. The back page carried a printed notice reproduced from a territorial law enforcement circular under the heading Outstanding Warrant. It read, "Wanted for questioning. One Colt Reeves, also known as James Colton, also known as Cole Rideout. Suspicion of horse theft, Gallatin County, 1879. Whereabouts unknown. Whereabouts. Contact Territorial Marshal's office." Vance said, "I thought you should know the character of the man working your property, out of respect for you and the boy." He left before she could respond. He always left before she could respond. She showed Colt the notice when he came to the farm at noon. She held it out and said nothing. He took it, read it, set it on the fence post. He did not deny it. He said, "I was going to tell you." Ellie said, "When?" "When I was sure you'd hear the reason before you heard the charge." "Tell me now." He told her. In 1879, he had worked for a rancher in the Gallatin Valley. The rancher stopped paying him at month 3. Cash flow problems, he said. At month 5, Colt took 2 horses from the stable, the 2 horses that represented his back wages in value by any fair accounting. He saddled them, sold one, kept one, rode out. The rancher filed a horse theft report the same day. The Territorial Marshal's office issued a warrant. The rancher was a man with standing and a written account. Colt was a man with nothing written down. He ran rather than face a hearing he knew would go against him. Ellie said, "Is that the whole of it?" Colt said, "That is the whole of it. You carried a warrant on your head and didn't think to mention it when you proposed working on my farm. I told you I'd rather not have the survey work done officially. That's not the same as telling me the truth." Colt said, "You're right." He had nothing else to say against that, and he did not try. Ellie said, "The thing I cannot forgive is not the warrant. People have had wrong charges brought against them. I understand that." He said, "Then what?" "You let me start to trust you while you were keeping something back." Her voice changed, slipping the control she kept so carefully. "Daniel did that to me for 7 years. Every week something he hadn't told me. Every month a new piece of the life I didn't know I was living. I stood at his grave and I thought, at least now I know all of it. And I still didn't." He said, "Ellie, I need you to leave. Today." "I understand." "Don't tell me you understand, just go." He went. That night, Ellie moved through the house gathering every trace of Colt's presence. The tool roll he had left on the kitchen shelf, the canvas work gloves on the porch railing, the handwritten list from her coat pocket. She put them in a wooden crate in the corner of the barn, closed the lid. Then she went back inside. Noah was sitting up in his bed, awake. Noah said, "Where did Mr. Reeves go?" Ellie sat on the edge of his bed, pulled him close. "He had to go for a while." "Is he coming back?" She did not answer. "Mama, is he coming back?" "I don't know, sweetheart." Noah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Are you going to cry?" "No." "You look like you're going to cry." "Go to sleep, Noah." She sat beside him until he went under. Then she went to the kitchen and sat at the table in the dark, not crying, not thinking in any organized way, just sitting in the specific stillness of a woman who had sent away the first person who had looked at her clearly in 2 years. Outside, the sky was absolutely clear. No storm, no drama, just the hard, dry, windless cold of the deepest part of winter, the kind that did not howl or blow, that just pressed in on every side until you stopped noticing where you ended and it began. That, she thought, was what being alone actually felt like. Not loud, not dramatic, just this. She sat there a long time, and in the silence, she began to think. Colt Reeves had not denied the warrant. He had explained it. And the explanation was the explanation of a man who had done what men did when the system that was supposed to protect fairness had been arranged against them. She knew that story. She was living that story. Her own forged signature was on a mortgage she had never seen. She thought about the wooden horse on Noah's pillow. She thought about the doubled support beam on the south end of the barn roof, put there without being asked because the man doing the work had actually looked at the structure and understood what it needed. She thought about, "I know," said with the weight of a man who had been watching her try for longer than he had admitted. She thought about HUD. Found in February. Ran out of reasons. She thought about the 7 words said in a cold general store by a man who had been sitting in a corner for 3 weeks watching and had chosen to act in the only way that would not shame her. She sat in the dark kitchen until the fire burned low. Then she went to the barn, opened the crate, and took out the folded list. Stood holding it. She did not put it back. Ellie rode to Billings alone, 2 days each way, midwinter. She left Noah with Agnes Fowler, Agnes who had looked away in Dawson's store, and she did this deliberately because she needed Agnes to understand that she was asking, that she was capable of asking, and that she trusted Agnes enough to make the request. It cost her pride. It cost her the comfort of her resentment toward Agnes, which she had been carrying like a coal that stayed warm. 12 miles out, her horse pulled up lame on a stretch of iced road. Not dangerously, not a break, but enough that she walked the animal for 4 miles in the dark at below freezing temperatures. She could have turned back. Nobody knew she had left. Nobody would have blamed her. She kept walking. In her inside coat pocket, she carried her mother's gold wedding band. She arrived in Billings on the afternoon of the second day, found the law office the Ridgemont Ranch foreman had recommended, and walked in without an appointment. The lawyer's consult fee was $2. She had $1.60. She took the ring from her pocket and put it on the desk. She said, "I need an hour of your time." The lawyer looked at the ring, looked at her. He said, "Sit down, Mrs. Calhoun." She did not watch when he picked the ring up. She looked out the window. If she watched, she would take it back. She spent the hour on two things. First, she presented the forged signature on the mortgage and asked what legal remedy existed. The lawyer examined it and confirmed what she had suspected. Without Vance's cooperation or a handwriting expert, the challenge was difficult but not impossible, especially if there was corroborating evidence of fraud elsewhere. If other properties in the valley showed similar irregular documentation, if there were patterns, a circuit judge could issue an injunction on all foreclosure actions pending investigation. It would require records. It would require witnesses. She said, "There may be others. A man named Hud Reeves, who worked land in the Gallatin Valley 3 years ago. He's dead now, but there may be records." Second, she asked about the outstanding warrant on Colt Reeves. The lawyer pulled the territorial circular. He examined it and said, "The originating complaint is from a rancher named Beaumont, Gallatin County. Beaumont went insolvent and left the territory in 1881. The warrant was never actively pursued. It's been sitting in the queue." He paused. "If you wanted to file a character affidavit on behalf of the named individual, someone willing to attest to his conduct in good standing for the period since the incident, a territorial judge could review and formally retire the warrant. It wouldn't be automatic, but it would give him grounds to move." Ellie took the pen. She signed her name. Eleanor Drummond Calhoun, farm proprietor, Harlan Creek, Montana Territory, underneath a sworn statement of Colt Reeves's character and conduct. She did this without knowing whether he would come back, without knowing whether he wanted to, without knowing whether it would matter. She signed it because it was true, and because the right thing did not require a guaranteed outcome to be the right thing. On the second day riding home, she passed the place where she had walked the lame horse in the dark. The ice had softened slightly in the afternoon sun. The road looked different in daylight, manageable, ordinary. She remembered thinking in the dark that night that she might not make it through. She had. She had done it cold and alone and unsure, and she had done it anyway. Daniel had made her smaller for years without her noticing. Every skill she had put away, every part of herself she had made quieter, so he would feel bigger. She had done it out of love and out of habit and out of not knowing she had a choice. She knew now. She rode the last 10 miles thinking about the two things she had signed her name to in that lawyer's office: the fraud challenge for herself, the character affidavit for a man who might not want what she had given him. Both of them had cost something. Both of them had been the right thing. And she had done them both for different people, one for herself and one for someone else, and she was all right with that. She was entirely all right with that. She arrived at the farm at first light on the fourth day. She expected it dark. She expected it empty. Instead, the kitchen lamp was lit, smoke from the chimney. She could smell coffee even from the barn. She stopped her horse at the gate and sat for a moment. Through the frost-rimmed window, she could see Colt Reeves sitting at the table with his hands around a cup. He was looking out the window. He saw her at the gate. He did not move. He had been there all night by the look of the low lamp. He did not leave. She rode to the barn, unsaddled, saw to her horse, took her time. When she came to the back door, she stopped with her hand on the latch. The question was not whether she was glad he had stayed. The question was whether gladness was enough reason to open the door. She opened the door. He pushed the papers across the table before she had finished her first cup of coffee. She read them in sequence while he watched her face go through a series of things he did not try to name. During the 3 days while Ellie was in Billings, Colt had gone to the Harlan Creek courthouse and examined recorded deeds for the past 6 years. Public record, available to anyone willing to sit in a cold room with the county clerk. What he had found was this: 11 properties in the valley had transferred to Vance's holding company in the last 5 years. 7 of those transfers had followed a death or severe illness. In 4 of them, the original landowner's signature on a late-period financial document had irregularities consistent with forgery. In 3 of them, the attending physician was the same man who had signed Daniel Calhoun's death certificate. And there was one more thing. The false witness report that had created the horse theft warrant on Colt carried a co-signatory name that Colt had never seen on the original territorial circular because it had been filed separately. He had found it in the courthouse records. Daniel Calhoun, not as the instigator, as the co-signer. Vance's bank had held Daniel Calhoun's note well before Daniel died. Vance had used that leverage to compel Daniel to sign the co-witness statement, a thing Daniel had likely not understood the full implication of, a thing he may have signed believing it was about a different matter entirely. In the last months of Daniel's life, according to the Silverhorn barkeep's informal recollection, Daniel had been asking questions around town about the terms of Hud Reeves's land loss. He had been getting close to understanding something. He had been poisoned before he could get there. Daniel Calhoun had died trying to make something right. He had not succeeded. He had made it worse in ways he never intended. He had been a man with real failures and real debts and real failings. And he had also been a man who was murdered because he was beginning to act on his conscience. When Ellie got to Daniel's name, she stopped, read it again. She said, "He signed it." Colt said, "Under duress." He owed Vance 4 years of debt by then. He was told it was a property dispute witness signature. I don't believe he knew the specific harm it would do. But he signed it. Yes. Ellie set the papers down, went to the window, stood there looking at the yard she had been keeping alive for 19 months with nothing but her own arms and the force of refusing to lie down. Colt said quietly, "Your husband was asking questions about HUD, about the Gallatin foreclosure." The barkeep at the Silverhorn said Daniel came in a lot in those last 3 months. Not to drink much, to ask. He was following a thread. Ellie said, "He didn't tell me." "No. He never told me anything." "No." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He wasn't a good man in a lot of ways." And he was. Both. She turned from the window. Her eyes were dry. "I think I've been waiting 19 months for permission to hold both of those things at the same time." Colt said, "You don't need my permission." "No, but it helps to have the truth." She looked at him. "Thank you for finding it." He said, "Ellie." She said, "I filed a character affidavit for the warrant under your name. In Billings." He was very still. She said, "I signed my name. The lawyer says a judge can retire it with that and the extenuating documentation. It's not guaranteed, but it's a real chance." Colt said, "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." She was not looking at him. "I sold my mother's ring to pay for the consult." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something neither of them had a clean word for. He said, "You didn't know if I was coming back." "No." "You didn't know if I'd want." "No." "Then why?" She set down her end of the wire. Faced him. "Because it was the true thing. You did not steal those horses. You took what was owed to you by the only means available. I know the difference between a man who takes what isn't his and a man who takes what is. And I signed my name because the difference matters, and because the record should say so." He said, "That's not the reason." She held his eyes. "No, it isn't the only reason." The afternoon light had gone gold and low, the kind that made everything in the valley look like a painting of itself. He took a step toward her and stopped. like a man checking his own velocity. He said, "I have been in motion for 3 years. I came here with a purpose and nothing else. I did not plan for this." She said, "Neither did I." Ellie. Colt. He said, "I don't know how to stop. Stop moving. Stop holding it all at a distance." She walked to him. She took his hand and turned it palm up, the way she would handle something that needed careful attention. She looked at the calluses, the cold, chapped knuckles, the particular map of a man's working life written on his skin. She said, "Then don't. Stop holding it at a distance." He closed his fingers around hers. That was all. That was everything. What happened in the weeks after had the quality of a thaw, not sudden, not simple. The kind of change that happens so gradually you cannot point to the moment it began, only to the morning you wake up and the ground is different under your feet. Agnes Fowler had been watching what Vance did to this valley for 5 years and had been afraid to speak. When Ellie came home from Billings and told Agnes what she had found, Agnes went to her kitchen, opened a drawer, and removed a letter. It was from her own late husband, written 2 years ago, describing a conversation with Vance in which Vance had openly discussed manipulating loan documentation. Agnes's husband had not been able to prove it. Agnes had been deciding ever since whether the letter mattered. Ellie said, "It matters." Agnes handed it over. The evidence package, combining the fraud documentation, the courthouse records Colt had assembled, Agnes Fowler's letter, and the physician's conflicting death certificate language, went to the county circuit judge in Billings through the lawyer Ellie had hired with her mother's ring. The circuit judge, who had had his own quiet concerns about Vance's rate of property acquisition for some time, issued a temporary injunction on all Vance foreclosure actions pending investigation. The Calhoun foreclosure was stayed. Vance made one more visit to the farm. This time he did not bring a basket. He came after dark with 2 men and dismounted at the gate without calling out. He stood there looking at the house in the specific way that was not a threat in words, but was unmistakably a threat. Colt came out of the barn. He did not draw. He did not speak. He walked to the fence line and stood there between Vance and the house and looked at Vance with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to men who had made peace with serious things and were no longer afraid of them. Vance looked at Colt for a long moment, then at his 2 men, then back at Colt. He rode away. The legal proceedings took 3 months. Vance was indicted on charges of fraudulent conveyance and deed falsification and bound over for trial at the Territorial District Court in Helena. If convicted, he faced incarceration at the Montana Territorial Prison in Deer Lodge. The criminal investigation into Daniel Calhoun's death was reopened. There was not enough evidence to bring a murder charge that would hold, but the record was amended. Daniel Calhoun's death was reclassified as circumstances unknown, investigation ongoing. It was not justice. It was the honest acknowledgement that there had been no justice. For Ellie, it was enough. 6 weeks after the legal proceedings began, late April, 1884. The snow was off the lower fields. The south field was showing the first green of the winter wheat Colt had planted in March. The water source on the northeast corner was running clean and full, court-protected, properly recorded. One evening, not a special evening, a Tuesday after supper, after Noah was in bed, Colt put something on the table between them, the folded paper, the handwritten list of farm repairs, worn at the folds, soft from being handled. Ellie recognized it. She had put it in the crate in the barn when she sent him away. She had put the crate in the corner. She had never gone back to it. She said, "You took it." Colt said, "Before I left." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because it was the closest thing I had to a reason to come back." He paused. "That's not entirely true. You were the reason. This was the proof that you'd let me." She picked up the list. The items were all crossed off now, one by one. Every repair, all of them done. She sat with it in her hands for a moment. He said, "I want to stay, not as a hand, not as a partner in the legal sense. I want to stay the way a man stays when this is his life, and not something he's passing through. Ellie looked at the crossed-off list, at the man across from her, at the window behind him where the south field was just beginning to green. She said, "Noah's going to need consistency. He'll need to know you're not going to." "I know. You can't half stay. It's all or nothing with a child." "I know that. If you're staying, you're staying." "That's what I said." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Then stay." They married 3 weeks later on the farm itself, outside in the May morning with a circuit preacher who was in the habit of conducting marriages in people's yards because he found churches overly formal for the purpose. Agnes Fowler was there, Tom Ridgemont from the cattle operation, the county clerk who had helped Colt read courthouse deeds and had quietly kept his counsel. 8 people total, which was exactly as many as either of them wanted. Ellie wore the blue dress she had worn to every significant occasion of her adult life, faded at the shoulders, immaculate at the hem. Colt wore a white shirt that was not a work shirt, and it was the first time she had seen him in one, and she filed that away with the other things she was learning about what Colt Reeves looked like when he was not working. Noah stood between them and held both their hands throughout, occasionally squeezing to make sure they were still there. When the preacher asked if there were words they would like to say, Ellie said, "7 words changed my life this winter. I'm adding 7 more. I choose you every day that follows." Colt said, "I came here for one reason and found a better one. I'm staying for all of it." Noah said, "Me too." The preacher laughed. He said, "I'll take that as unanimous consent." 3 years later, autumn 1886. The farm they called Calhoun Reeves, the name changed on the county deed record 4 months after the wedding at Noah's suggestion, because he wanted everyone to have the same name, was not a fairy tale. The summer of 1885 had been dry and the wheat came in thin. There was still a year of legal costs that would take time to settle. Colt's leg bothered him every winter. Ellie still woke sometimes in the small hours with the particular anxiety of someone who had been in survival mode long enough that peace felt like a thing she might lose by touching it. None of that was solved. People were not solved. They got better at carrying what they carried. What was true was this. The water source on the northeast corner fed 3 neighboring farms under a cooperative agreement the county judge had helped structure after Vance's conviction. The farmers who benefited from it did not pay Ellie money. They paid in labor 1 day per season each, and in the knowledge that her land was never worked alone. The valley had learned something from what Vance had built and what it had cost. Not perfectly. Not permanently. But something. Noah was 7. He read well, rode well, could name 14 birds by their calls and explain why the south-facing slope thawed faster in spring. He called Colt Pa. The word had arrived one morning with no ceremony, as naturally as a bird landing on a fence, and no one had mentioned it because it needed no comment. Agnes Fowler came for Sunday dinner twice a month. She had become, without anyone planning it, a kind of aunt to Noah and a kind of friend to Ellie, the real kind of friend, the kind built from shared difficulty rather than convenience. She still sometimes apologized indirectly for the moment in Dawson's store. Ellie had told her once that it was forgiven, and she meant it. On a September afternoon, the harvest in, the last of the light doing what Montana autumn light did, which was to make everything look too beautiful to be real and then be real every year, Colt was in the yard teaching Noah to shoe a horse. The old bay that had been with the farm since Daniel's time and had outlasted most things stood patient at the post. Noah was concentrating with his whole face, the way he concentrated on things that mattered to him. He got the first nail set clean. He looked up. Ellie was standing at the barn door watching. Noah saw her watching. He said, "Mama, did you see?" She said, "I saw. I did it right." "You did." He ran to her, 7 years old, hands black with hoof oil, face red from the cold coming in, and grabbed her hand and dragged her toward the horse. "Come see. Come look at it." She let herself be dragged. Colt was watching them come across the yard, his wife and his son, the light falling on the farm he had repaired with his own hands and was still repairing and would continue to repair, because that was what you did with a thing you intended to keep. He looked at Ellie over Noah's head. She looked back at him. No words, no gesture. Just the look of two people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of each other's damage, and had been living with that choice long enough to know it was right. Noah pulled Ellie's hand to the horse's hoof. "See? Right there. That's the nail I set." Ellie crouched down, looked. "Perfect," she said. "Pa taught me." "I know. He's a good teacher." She looked up at Colt. Something in her face that she would not have allowed anyone to see 3 years ago. Open, unhidden. The face of a woman who had stopped being afraid of being known. "He is," she said. The light held a moment longer than it should. The valley below the farm was going golden brown. Noah was already talking again, explaining the next step, the one Colt had told him about, the one they would practice tomorrow. Tomorrow. She used to think only in terms of what had to get done before it got worse. She had not thought about tomorrow as a place she was going. She had thought about it as a deadline, something to survive until, rather than something to arrive at. Now she thought about it as a room she had not been in yet, a room she was looking forward to entering. That was what he had given her, not the roof, not the fence, not the legal fight, though all of those had mattered and she would not diminish any of it. He had given her back the capacity to want tomorrow, the capacity to stand in a September yard with hoof oil on her hand and her son's voice in her ear and the man she had chosen standing 20 feet away and feel not the bracing tension of someone waiting for loss, but the simple open warmth of someone who understood she was exactly where she was supposed to be. In Harlan Creek, they would tell the story for years. How the widow who would not quit and the man who would not stay had found each other in the worst winter in memory and built something that outlasted both their fears. They usually left out the part about the mortgage and the water rights and the territorial court proceedings. But they always remembered the 7 words. Because some things began so simply and lasted so long that it seemed like they should have required more. They did not. 7 words, the right ones. Said once in the corner of a general store by a man who had been watching and waiting and had chosen the only way to help that would not take something from her in the giving. "Put it on my tab." She takes everything. She did. She always had. She just needed one person to say so out loud, in a voice that meant it on a day when every other voice in the room had looked away. The rest of it, the fence and the fight and the love that had grown in the grammar of shared labor on cold mornings, the rest had been possible all along. The 7 words were the door, and she had walked through it, on her own 2 feet, in her own time, carrying her son's hand in hers and her mother's ring in her pocket, and 19 months of refusal to lie down in her spine. That was how it had started. That was how it continued. That was enough. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.